Hello, everybody. How we doing today? So first, I want to apologize for the phone reversed image issue. Uh, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out my phone, what was going on with it, why it was doing this, and I could not get to the bottom of it. And so finally, my wife did some research on it, and apparently, it's a glitch with this phone. For those of you who remember, my phone died a month ago or so. I did an update when it was dead. I turned it back on, and a number of things were just different and strange. And my wife went to the phone's actual site in the chat room. Now, a lot of people have had this issue with this mirror image thing, and apparently there's no way to fix it. It's just, it doesn't do it all the time. Some of the technicians from the company denying it even happens, and yet there's tons of people on this site complaining that this has been happening excuse me, to them on photos and videos. Other people saying that they tried to make a video for YouTube or some of the other little sites out there, and it's just mirror image, and they can't do nothing to change it. And so I just got to remember to change it in my editing program, or I can get a new phone, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. I guess I can download a new phone app. But we got this phone specifically for this camera. It was supposed to be one of the best for doing what I'm doing. So my wife picked it. So it's a little frustrating that we had this issue with this stupid reversed image. I put a post-it on my monitor. Hopefully I remember to reverse it. But again, guys, I'm sorry about it. It's one of those things where I've made 500 episodes. It's been an issue the last 15 or 20 episodes. And I just go through the process of doing the editing and uploading it and all the different steps I do. That's not a step I've normally done, is reversing the image. And it's not hard to do. It slips my mind. So here's hoping that the post-it on the monitor will help me remember to flip that image. And maybe I'll try downloading a new phone app. But again, this is supposed to be one of the best phones for what I'm doing. So, again, I don't know really what to do. I'll open to suggestions, but I don't see myself changing phones anytime soon. Our money's on a pretty tight budget nowadays, and it's just how we've been living these last few years since my DJ work's kind of dried up, frustratingly so. Eyes are watering today. There's a bit of an allergy thing going on. We live in a small town. There's a lot of corn dust in the air, and there's a lot of not harvesting, but turning up the soil so they can plant. It just puts a lot of dust and pollen and stuff. And my allergies have always struggled with living in the country. We live in a small town, but we're surrounded by farmland. So I hope you all enjoying that Legacy series. And again, I wanted to kind of define that a little bit. It's not just what my favorite record is by an artist. That would be a different thing. A legacy record is something that it's probably the last likely thing to be in print by someone. It's what they're going to be remembered for. And so we're not always picking the most critically acclaimed, like a Love Supreme or Lee Morgan's Search for New Land or whatever. We're picking the one that is going to always have that commercial place in the world, that their name's going to be associated with first. That's the go-to to get the best understanding of who that artist is. And certainly it's a debatable thing. I have a hard time picking them sometimes myself. But it can't just be your favorite, because that's not what a legacy is about. You know, you have to be a little more critical in your thinking, I think. And it's like picking the favorite player from your sports team. Your favorite versus the legacy player isn't always going to be the same guy. And the legacy guy is something that your wife's going to know by name. Your kids, your grandkids, like legacy names are just big names that have a commercial, almost pop sensibility to them. And certainly a lot of our favorite records aren't going to be the legacy of an artist. And so I want to make that distinction, because I'm getting a lot of comments saying, well, my favorite is this. And I don't mind the comment. It's great, and I'll share with you and talk about what my favorite is as well. But again, that's not what legacy is defining. And so we're trying to almost, I think, for beginners, create a go-to first record, a must-have, in a sense, the one that's going to give you as good an overview of an artist as you're going to get from one album. And with jazz, it's really hard. With jazz, it's really hard to reduce someone to one record. Some artists are easier to reduce down than others. Like Coltrane to me was probably the most difficult one. It's why I waited so long to do it. And I don't think I really came up with an answer I was happy with on Coltrane's legacy. You could almost certainly make a case for several Coltrane records being his legacy, and I think that's a fair assessment. But that's not what this exercise is. It's Coltrane's a legacy record. So anyway, I just wanted to clear that definition up a little bit. And again, it's completely arbitrary, and people's favorite records do matter. And a lot of people said Love Supreme was their favorite John Coltrane. And for years, that probably would have been my answer as well. But I think that also echoes a lot of what the critics say, and kind of informs a lot of our opinions, and kind of we streamline them with what, not our own personal, it just becomes a bit of a, they steer us. You know, we're all guilty of that, being steered by the reviews and the publicity and the legacy of what other critics have had to say. You know, it's pretty hard to escape that at times. You really have to have a pretty broad knowledge of an artist, I think, to be able to escape some of that mind shaping. But I just kind of cracked a nail, which is annoying to me. I always have a hard time with a cracked or a little hangnail. Drives me nuts. Well, I just cracked this one pretty good, and you can see that. It's gonna bug me. It's deep enough too where I can't just trim it off. And of course, it comes from another little nick I got into the other day that started the whole thing. Now it's just zooming towards the center of the earth, frustratingly so. So I got some cool ideas coming up for episodes down the road here, and I want to talk about some labels again. I think labels are the important way to get to know the jazz story the best, because each label is, in a sense, this universe. Think of it in terms of movies or comic books. Like, you have different universes of characters and storylines and interacting characters that complement each other throughout the universe. And jazz labels are certainly that same type of thing, which is very different from rock and roll. You don't ever get the sense that rock and roll bands are super influenced by the labels they're on in terms of who else they work with and changing sidemen. Like, it doesn't really work in rock and roll the same way. In jazz, if you were part of a certain label stable, it was going to influence your sound. It was going to influence the racial makeup of your bands. It was going to influence who your sidemen were going to be. The labels do tell an overreaching story that's sometimes a broader context than the artists themselves. And once you get to know the labels pretty well, you can see how a lot of artists are as impacted by what label they're on as they are by their sidemen or by their own whims. A guy like Art Farmer's kind of a great example. Art Farmer's records really tend to mold themselves to the labels that they're on. Cannibal Adderley. You know, Adderley's records, what label he's on makes a big difference. Even Coltrane to some degree, even though Coltrane's career arc almost kind of shapes the label. But he doesn't really fit that billing. But you can certainly look at labels and almost in a way have a better consensus of this body of music that's going to be more unified. And this isn't almost the case, but there's labels where the sound and the look and the feel and the tempo are going to be more unified than those individual artists that might be on that label for a while but move on and have different careers in different eras. The label can sometimes be a more finite definition of a sound than the artists themselves. an artist's career might span a lot of different labels, a lot of different sounds and genres. Generally, the jazz labels, especially these smaller ones, have a pretty short shelf life. You know, sometimes as little as 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Some of the smallest imprints only have a few releases. The intro label only has a few releases, an Art Pepper, and then that other Art Pepper with Gerald Wiggins collaboration, whatever that one's called. Those are the 2 records I know of on Intro. But turns out Intro is a subsidiary of, oh my God, I just went blank. Jazzland is also of Aladdin. And so Aladdin was this label that has some Dizzy Gillespie, I don't know, sorry, not Dizzy, Illinois Jacquette, Lester Young, and also a lot of other West Coast stuff. And they have the Intro imprint and the Jazz West imprint were under their umbrella. Both very short-lived labels. The Jazz West, I think, has 8 titles. And one of them is a coupling of 2 10-inches that they already had released by the great trumpet player, whose name escapes me right now, not Shad Collins. Boy, it's to my tongue. The great Jack Sheldon was what I was thinking of. He's got 2 10-inches on Jazz West. They get coupled into a regular record as part of a later album in that sequence. And so, like, eight records. That was it for Jazz West. Intro, I think there's only the 2 that I know of. And so it's a very convoluted thing. And what you kind of realize is there's a kind of a cannibalization of the jazz labels. And something I want to kind of dive into a little bit more in depth, especially if you guys are kind of interested in this stuff. It might be a little bit too detailed, minutia for some. I don't know. I've got like some feedback on this. But like Tampa, that label on the West Coast, Tampa's 30 releases, a number of them are from the Skylark label. A number of them are from the Dig label. A number of them are from the Motif label that they repackaged, gave new covers to, and then Tampa issued them under their own sequence. Sometimes they give these records 2 covers, Tampa. So they have their original Skylark Motif Dig cover, I love those early versions. I like to find those if I can. I have most of the Tampa versions as well. I said a lot of the Tampa versions have an alternate cover just to kind of confuse you even more. But then Tampa, and I believe Mode, I'm not positive, but I think Mode as well, was bought by Interscope, was it? Or what's that label with the Art Pepper with the peppers on it? It might be Pepper Adams, actually, with all the peppers on it. That label buys up Tampa and Mode, I think, and repackages all the stuff again with a different cover. It's kind of non-stop when you look at it closely. Blue Note itself was eventually bought by the Liberty album, label. And then Liberty sells to United Artists not too long after that. And then going forward, that process continues to the point where we only had 3 or 4 major labels with a lot of labels underneath them in the entire music scene, not just in jazz. But to see and get to know this cannibalism of the jazz labels in the 50s into the 60s, it's informative. It helps us from buying the same music 2 and 3 times, which, can happen if you like to have both versions. Sometimes it's fun for the art's sake or just getting to know the history. But I've also bought a duplicate record with a different cover on a different label not knowing numerous times. And got home only to realize, like, oh shit, this is that. That Rocky Boyd record I bought has another version on Muse. It's on one of those 70s labels. They give Kenny Dorham the leadership of it. All Coltrane's early work that wasn't under Coltrane's name eventually got reissued under Coltrane's name, especially if I buy Prestige, but also like Pablo does a few of those. It's pretty nonstop the more I look at all the different jazz labels, and very few of them existed in a vacuum and then weren't bought by someone and repackaged. And the labels today, like the Fresh Sounds, will often replicate the original artwork and not try to put their own marketing or labeling on it too much. And like the classic records that did the Blue Note stuff back in the 90s, early 2000s, their replications of the original Blue Notes were pristine. They had the shiny, glossy covers. They had the original liner notes on the back. I'm not sure if those records on the jackets themselves even gave mention of the classic record moniker. And so it's something it would take a little bit of research to compile. It's something I'm already kind of doodling in my notebooks upstairs while I watch TV with my wife. I'm often making notes of things and jogging my memory. And I'm trying to, like, it is in the bathtub. I'm like, hey, wife, does underneath Skylark, does it say Tampa on my notebook there? I'm like just trying to remember all these connections. Does that say motif in Tampa underneath that one too? So I wrote down all these different labels, and then I started connecting the dots. And it's, like I said, I think it's kind of interesting. It's even explaining how, like, a Pacific Records and the Blue Note Records both are being issued by Tone Poet right now. It's the cannibalism of these labels. And I guess probably the ultimate example is Fantasy Records out of San Francisco, as the jazz age kind of wanes and other genres of music are the primary source of sales. Fantasy starts sweeping up a lot of the other great jazz labels around them, including Contemporary, Riverside, and Prestige, which are three of the biggest labels in jazz. So you suddenly have those four labels, Fantasy, Contemporary, Riverside, and Prestige, under one OJC roof, along with Debut. I don't think Candid was part of it, but there is other little labels that got, thrown into that mix because Fantasy bought them up. And so it is a very convoluted story. And a lot of the small labels start so small and have so few releases, but end up being part of a much bigger sequence. Transition out of Boston, being run by Tom Wilson, was it? I think it's Tom Wilson. Blue Note somehow ends up with some of that stuff. Bethlehem buys up the period labels, jazz releases, including some Mingus stuff. That Mingus stuff on Bethlehem, I believe, was mostly done by Period and Leonard Feather. And Period was mostly a classical label, but they did do some jazz stuff. And I believe it was under Leonard Feather's guidance. He kind of influenced them to do some jazz titles, including that great Thad Jones and some Maxine Sullivan, the great singer that influenced Ella and a lot of other people. And so Period Records ends up being bought by Bethlehem. And Bethlehem makes very little indication that these titles aren't their own titles. And then shortly after that, King buys Bethlehem and kind of bastardizes the Bethlehem label and starts releasing their own vault jazz work on the Bethlehem imprint. Like, it just keeps going on and on. There's the Signal label, which has some good stuff by Duke Jordan and Cecil Payne, and I kind of wanted to talk about that label here for a second. So let's dive into that one, and then we'll move on. So here's a great example. I'm going to show you this, and it gets confusing even for a guy that has fairly extensive discographies of these labels. I still get, like, where did these titles come from again? They weren't recorded by this label. They were brought in here. So there's this little label called Signal. I think they were in New York. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. And they released, I think it's about 6 or 7 titles. 7. And Savoy buys that and issues them, like, in the 12 140s, in the 12,000 series, somewhere in the 12 140s, late 12 130s. They dovetail in these 7 releases by Signal Records. And the first 2 are these Duke Jordan Laboratory series, Hal Overton Laboratory series. And I got these both from Japan recently. And I didn't realize these were separate titles from the other Duke Jordan. I was kind of confused, honestly. And the Discogs catalog that I had printed off, sorry, not Discogs, the Wikipedia catalog I had printed off for Savoy Records had been filled in incorrectly. So some of the numbers were wrong, some of the titles were wrong in this region of the Savoy discography. I need to look to see if it's been fixed now, because if not, I should probably try to fix it. But the Wikipedia Savoy that I printed off good 4 years ago probably was incorrect. And so I had to figure it out. And I kind of got to the bottom of it by digging through Discogs and making some cross-references and figuring it out. And so these are the first 2. And they're 12-145 and 12-146 in the Savoy release series. but they were Signal 101 and 102 is what they were. And I think in both cases here, they're called laboratory series for this reason. They have a fuller band on side one. And then, if I remember correctly, they stripped down to a trio, piano, bass, and drums on side two, to allow young players to try to play along with and replicate the horn players on the first side. And I'm not positive, but I think that's the theory that was here and why they were. And there's another label called Music Minus One that does that same thing, where they have some great artists come in and they'll record instrumental tracks and then leave some space for a soloist to kind of practice and rehearse with the record. Again, there was no YouTube back in the 50s and 60s, so it's a pretty cool concept. And the Music Minus One stuff, some of it must have sold pretty well because you see them out there quite a lot. I only have a couple of them. I don't know how many there are altogether, but interesting stuff all the same. So these are the two first, but they weren't the first two that Sad Boy reissued. That's 12-145 and 12-146. We'll soon see that. What they did issue first, I believe, was this one. It's 12-01 in the Signal series, as you can see right there. But in the Sad Boy series, it's 12-137. And again, it's Nika's Tempo with Gigi Grice, Horace Silver, Thelonious Monk's on part of this, Art Blakey, Cecil Payne, Oscar Pettiford, Percy Heath, Julius Watkins, Kenny Clark, Art Farmer, and Ernestine Anderson. And again, the two sides, I don't think, they're two different sessions, I'm almost positive. And one of them was an early Monk session. I think that's of note, if my memory serves. Again, my memory's kind of blurry at this point. I think there's also a color version of this cover. And then, and for the most part, these Signal records had different covers on Signal than they got on Savoy. So Savoy went to great lengths to make them look as Savoy as possible in terms of their look. And there's no mention of the Signal. There's no mention of the Signal logo. There's no mention of the original Signal art. They look like Savoy releases, but they're not really. Duke Jordan, I think this one has another name as well at times, Trio and Quintet. Again, I think this one's cover is not too different from the original Signal. There's 1202 in the Signal, so you got 1201, 1202. In the Savoy series, this is 12149. So it's a good 12 releases away from that one. They're all in a similar area, but they don't come out sequentially by any way, which happens at times. The great Charlie Byrd, who was famous for helping bring along the Bossa Nova with Stan Getz. They went to Brazil together, if I remember. Bird's records were all on some other small label, Weather Vane or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And then Riverside buys that after Charlie Byrd kind of goes big time with the Bossa Nova at Verve. And then Riverside buys up all of Charlie Bird's old titles on that small label and actually issues them all sequentially in the Riverside discography. So all of a sudden there's like 9 Charlie Byrd releases in a row. And then they sign him to the label and he starts recording new music for Riverside. And again, this is like 61, 62 towards the end of the Riverside run. But that last 40 records at Riverside in the 400 sequence, there's a 15 Charlie Byrd records in there. And about 6 or 7 of them have original covers and artwork from a different small label. So it's a pretty common thing for these labels to cannibalize and consume each other. This is 1203. So there was the first two that were those laboratory series that were 101 and 102. There was 1201, 1202, 1203. This is Cecil Payne Quartet. In the Savoy sequence, it gets 12147. So again, similar area, but they're not coming out chronologically. How Deep on the Ocean, by the way, on this is fantastic. Cecil Payne, for those of you who don't know, is a fantastic baritone sax player. Just a nice... he's not probably as rich as some of the players in terms of his tonality, but he's also got a great bebop, hard bop sense to him. He seems like he's got a lot on his mind a lot of the time. He played with some fairly important players, and this record has Kenny Dorham, Tommy Potter, Duke Jordan, Art Taylor. So you're talking about some pretty serious Blue Note Prestige Riverside talent being recorded by Signal that Savoy cannibalizes. This is the music of Charlie Parker, played by, and then it lists the musicians. Under Signal, this was just released as Cecil Payne at Night at the 5 spot. This was a Cecil Payne record through and through under Signal, number 1204. Here it's 12138. So actually it's an earlier release of Signal by Savoy. But they don't give lead billing to Cecil Payne. He's not the lead bill. He's kind of equal billed with Phil Woods and Frank Socolow, Duke Jordan, Wendell Marshall, and Art Taylor. This was a Cecil Payne record. Make no mistake about it. And Signal had it that way. Savoy, I think, just wanted to put Charlie Parker's name out front. Parker's not on this. They're just playing the music of Parker, in a bebop, hard bop sense. Interesting lineup, again, with Socolow and Woods, Duke Jordan and Wendell Marshall, Cecil Payne. So you got a couple White Cats, Four Brothers. Interesting stuff. Signal was doing some good work. And I don't mind this cover, but it's different, again, from the 5-spot cover that Signal did. And then last in this sequence was this Red Rodney. Signal skips 1205. I'm guessing there was something meant to be released. It never got released. 1206 came out. The 1205 does anybody know what Signal 1205 was? I can't find any track or record of that. But Red Rodney, a fiery red-headed trumpet player, thus the nickname Red, with the great Iris Sullivan on this, Tommy Flanagan, Oscar Pettiford, and Philly Joe Jones. And Rodney's an important player. Rodney was such a great player that he backs Parker and one of Parker's bands for a number of years. He records with Parker, I think, at Dial, if I remember. I always got to quantify things now because there's so much data floating around in my head at times. I got to make sure I'm grabbing the right bits. But yeah, this is Red Rodney. And again, he plays with Parker for a long time, which is pedigree in and of itself. When you're playing with one of the true architects of the genre of the music, which Parker is unquestionably, there's no questioning a guy like Red Rodney's status as a player. The guy could blow. He's got a bright, ferocious tone, similar. I don't want to say Freddie Hubbard because Freddie Hubbard's a little cleaner. Maybe Donald Byrd, maybe Lee Morgan, but he's got that same intensity as those guys, Byrd and Morgan. Very bright, full, not a lot of cloudy milk in his tone. He's more that crystal, hard-blowing trumpet player versus that soft, fuzzier player that some of the guys tend to be like Miles and Art Farmer. So Roddy's a great player. 1206 Signal, 12148 on Savoy. So what you see here is an entire label's output cannibalized and consumed by the Savoy label. And it's like, the truth of it is, this is part of the jazz story. It's part of the history. And we have to kind of understand even the production values of a certain label might make them stand out from what the parent label that bought them is doing at that time. A lot of times there's a departure in what a label sounds like for a brief minute, and it's because that label's suddenly putting out stuff that they didn't record. Some of that Bethlehem stuff that they got from Period, again, it's kind of a little different, a little bit more modern in terms of the edges, like the Mingus. There's just a little more quirk to it than what Bethlehem was normally doing at that time. So I guess I kind of covered some of the bases there for you. And again, as a collector, it's important to know some of this stuff. And sometimes you want to even decide at some point, which of those versions do I want? And you always kind of want to have the oldest if you can, but the cost can be prohibitive. Sometimes you got to look at which versions are being repressed and put out there. If you can find a nice reissue of the original cover or artwork, sometimes that's worth going for versus trying to find an old one that's going to be too expensive or the second version with a different cover. And then to confuse things even more, labels like Savoy and Prestige take their own releases and give them new covers or new leaders. I mean, this was done initially with so-and-so as a leader, but this guy's hot now. So let's repackage that record under that guy's name, give it a new cover, a new number in the sequence, and we'll pretend it's a new release when it's really something that's already been put out. So there's a whole lot of cannibalism going on in the jazz record industry, a whole lot of repackaging, a whole lot of deception. But this also leads to a lot of this music staying around. Let's be honest, if Savoy hadn't released the Signal stuff, the Signal stuff would be that much more obscure and forgotten. And the demand for those originals would be through the roof. So sometimes the cannibalism has positive aspects to it. It's a mixed bag. It truly is. So I hope you all enjoyed that. Again, we can go into deeper detail with it and actually show you the records like I did with the Signal stuff. Some of you guys want to see it. It's something I'm kind of continuing doing the research on right now. And so I think I could probably represent it in a month or a few weeks even, with even more detail, even more minutia. I guess it's what it boils down to. But again, there's a racial line that it's not crossed even in this aspect. You know what I mean? It's fairly interesting how it all unfolds. And like even with fantasy buying Prestige and Contemporary and Riverside, those purchases happened in the 70s once integration was far more commonplace and far less of something a label had to be concerned with in a popular opinion kind of way. So what happens in the 50s by these labels versus what happens much later in the 70s. And fantasy manages to keep their independence for a long time. Of course, they had a great deal of success in rock and roll with Creedence Clearwater Revival, which gave them a kind of a platform, a foundation to stand on and to do some of the other things they wanted to do that they probably couldn't have done without something like Creedence being as massive as a band as they were. The Creedence Clearwater Revival, one of the great kind of garage rock bands of all time. It's a very short window. They make, I think, 3 or 4 records in 69. I think their first one's in 68. I think there's 3 or 4 albums in 69. They just churn them out, full of classics. And there's one more record, I think, in 70, and then a couple Chronicle Greatest Hits, and they're done. They're gone. But they were one of those bands that always kind of stood the test of time, always stayed on classic radio, and so they always were reissuing those Creedence records, and certainly was the thing that kept fantasy fluent and money and operations. So it's an interesting subject for some, probably not so much for others. I gotta go remember to flip this video right now when I get up there. Again, I apologize, guys. It sucks. It sucks that so many of them are showing backwards and the records are showing up backwards. And I've even gone up there going, gotta remember to flip this, and still forgotten because I have my process that I do for hundreds of videos. And it's just a step I'm not normally doing. And so until something changes, and it doesn't sound there's any solution coming to the phone issue, it's just I got to remember to do it myself manually now. And again, the number of complaints, it's just a glitch that doesn't sound like there's any attempt to making it to fix it. Doesn't sound like from what the phone's webpage said. All the comments were plenty of complaints, and then a few people from the phone company themselves saying, we don't know that this is even true. Kind of denying it, which is frustrating. So maybe they'll do an update in a few months and it'll fix itself. I guess for some people it's happening in photographs and videos. For me, it only seems to be happening in videos. It doesn't seem to happen all the time. I had a few where it was fine. Thought I fixed it, but then it came back. So it's kind of annoying, technology. It's a great thing. You know, I mean, it's got us connected and talking to each other from around the world. And that's one of the things I was most proud about my 500th episode. I want to again thank you all for who contributed. But the international vibe of that episode, we had Australia in the mix. We had a lot of Europeans, Scots, Irish, Englishmen, France, Belgium. That was what was impressive to me. Sweden, I think it was the Dane. We had a real international kind of cosmopolitan group of people who contributed to that episode. And that's probably something I'm most proud of, that international broadness of the scope of this channel. We try not to ever limit ourselves to just one way of thinking. You know, we like to be broad-minded and human earthlings. Human earthling is what I am. I'm not a nation, I'm not a religion, I'm not a race. I'm a human earthling. Race, religion, and nation are all the constructs of the societies we live in, and they're very temporal. And one of my favorite sayings I said to my kids their whole lives is the opposite of the society you're born into is the reality of all things. Society is but a slice in time of how they chose to do things. When you stack up every society that's ever existed throughout time, going back to the Aboriginals 40,000 years ago in Australia, into the future, all those slices of time called societies in aggregate become reality. Reality is not something temporal to your society. It's the inclusion of all ways of doing things ever. That's reality. That's actually really empowering. That means that because my society condemns this or doesn't do it this way, there's societies throughout time that have done it that way. You can't do something that some society at some point hasn't done. So reality is a far broader concept than the limitations of the societies we're born into. And I think my philosophy is so wrapped up in that broad human, I don't want to be of nation. And I'm proud to be Canadian, but it doesn't mean a whole lot outside of the Olympics. You know what I mean? I'm a human earthling. And when I see my planet from space through the mindset of astronomy and realize the vulnerable little blue marble that we're on and the frailty of it, Sting says, fragile, how fragile we are. One of my favorite songs of all time. Thank you, Sting. It just should resonate with all of us. How united we are as a people and how that migration is one group. And it's only in the strongest conforming of societies and nations where we lose sight of that. And I've met a lot of Americans who've become more American than human. And imagine a shelf of canned tomatoes. I've said this before. And there's a bunch of tomatoes on that shelf saying, we're not tomatoes, we're Del Montes. We're Doles. We're not tomatoes. That's a dumb tomato. Peel the labels off those cans and all you're left with is tomatoes. Peel the label off your can. Don't be of nation. Don't be of race or religion. Be human earthling. Be a tomato. I mean, that's the true definition of what you are. And so when we try to become more than that and use it as an excuse to justify a lack of empathy for others, that's propaganda. That's control. Because you are a part of all these things. The reality of things is much bigger than the societal constraints that we live under. And society needs us thinking small, often, to justify the inequity between us and them. So think small. They want us to be rigid in our way of thinking, not fluid and grasping and encompassing all things. Boy, I haven't talked about this stuff in a while on the channel, and I need to every once in a while. So be a human earthling, be a tomato. Don't be a Dole. Don't be a Del Monte. That's a dumb tomato. A tomato that thinks the label on the can defines it, instead of just being defined by what it is, the ingredients inside the can, that's nonsense. And we see the divide that exists with these far right groups and some of the far left groups as well. And the nonsense of the political banter and ideology that a lot of us just destined to polarize and to keep us powerless and from having consensus, because consensus would create change, especially in a democratic process. And so when they create this logjam of division, no progress can happen, no change can take place. The status quo will remain. This isn't a left or right thing. It's just we're all been herded like sheep. The left is as guilty of it in so many ways. And I'm more akin with the policies of the left than I am with the policies of the right. The policies of the right are too enveloped with war and weapons of war and ultimate greed and environmental destruction. I think the right has made a lot of drastic mistakes. And they've grafted in a lot of awful social restraints to try to get the masses voting for them along these social lines here in America, and actually creates a climate where a lot of people vote against their own interests due to some moral issues they think they're undertaking and helping. It's nonsense. And even abortion, a woman, her family, and her doctor should decide that. It's not a federal election issue. It's only become that to create division. It's a great line you can draw between the population and sever them in half. And I'll never work with that group, and I certainly won't work with that group, and I can't ever even talk to that group. Suddenly we're all in our little pockets of division, and now we can't create a consensus to make change. It's so cleverly crafted. And every story on the news is spun this way and that way to create two groups that are so isolated that never the twain shall meet. And I'm going to end my episode right there because never the twain shall meet is just a great thing to say. And sometimes you just can't control what comes out your mouth. You just got to let it go. So anyway, I appreciate you all. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't. If you enjoy this kind of content, hit the like button. If you want to hit the bell for alerts to know when new episodes come out once or twice a week. Sometimes we get a third episode in there. Y'all be blessed. Y'all stay safe. Love from my heart, all my human earthlings. We got to be strong and think this way because philosophy is an important thing. And that's one last thing I wanted to touch on. And I want to do an episode on this coming up soon too. Is the philosophy of the music I listen to has a real large impact on what I'm comfortable listening to in my own headspace. As a DJ, I can get a lot of different things out there. But when I'm in my own headspace listening to music, if you don't have a philosophy in your music that has some confluence with my own belief system, it's hard for me to sit in that headspace. I'm going to work in my brother's shop sometimes, and they play a lot of country music, honestly. And some of the country music is so nationalistic and so just about beer drinking and God made us good people and it doesn't matter what we do because we're white and God loves us. That's this awful, overreaching message. And this is the commercialized flag-waving country of the last 25 years, not Waylon, Merle, Willie, and Hank. Those guys had some soul. Patsy Cline had some soul. Hank Williams is one of the most teary-eyed, that guy's got some soul. This nonsense that they make, it's like this watered-down praise and worship, a lot of it. The lyrics are so cheesy. I can't stand it, honestly. And a lot of it's because I just can't stand the philosophy, and I don't adhere with it. I can't live with it. I don't want it in my headspace, which made me come to a realization. I want to dive into this deeper in another episode, but when it comes to white American music, I own a lot of it. I like a great deal of it, but I had a hard time thinking about white American artists that I love, that move me. I had a hard time. Plenty of black American music just fills my soul with power. Stirs me up. I'm like, woo! That's what you get when you try to pull some people down. That shit bubbles back up. Freedom. Black American music stirs my drink. There's a lot of great music from the UK, from Jamaica, that I love. And I can listen to Bob Marley any day because I believe his philosophy and mine agree. And I listen to Rudimental. I listen to The Orb from the UK. Massive Attack. There's a philosophy going on in that music. Jamiroquai. I got that human connection. Even Coldplay has a consciousness that I can kind of connect with you too. It's hard for me to think of white American bands that stirred that in me. That I said, oh, I love this. This is my DNA. This is my consciousness, my spirituality, my philosophy. And I was only able to think of one group that I'm like, I love them. I'm going to leave you hanging on that note. Y'all want to guess who it is? Peace.